Hi everybody, Shannon and Karen with Wandering Out Yonder. Today we are at the Appalachian Trail Museum to bring you another in the series, the Appalachian Trail Museum and the community that surrounds it. Today we're going to be meeting a gentleman named Craig Eckert.
Right, now he is the author of the book that's called Rocks, Roots, and Rattlesnakes. Now this book is about his 2020 thru hike, and he talks about the trail through a geologist's perspective.
Yep, so anyhow, come along with us and listen to what Craig has to say.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you all sticking around. I have to say that I've been really impressed with all the folks that I've met so far today, and the folks that I've listened to, and the passion that they all have for this whole undertaking. I mean, the museum itself is a work of art. The structure that has been reassembled and all the hard work that went into it is amazing. And I'm really humbled to be following up in all of those presentations and discussions. But I won't give an introduction for myself, but I will say that when I was younger, I grew up in the Lehigh Valley, and I used to be in Boy Scouts and school clubs where we would hike up to the Pinnacle now and then, or do parts of the Appalachian Trail with friends of mine. And I've probably done maybe a week-long trip when I was younger, but it wasn't until 2020 when I decided that I would set out on maybe like a 500-mile, let's see how it goes type hike, starting at the southern terminus, and then going forward up to Virginia. And about a week into that, I decided, why not just do the whole thing? And so from there, I just continued on, and I'm sure, like many of you who are thru hikers, you had various epiphanies out there or realizations that hey, this is something that I think I can really do, because I wasn't sure that I would be able to, and so I got started and was fortunate enough to maintain healthy knees and everything else throughout the adventure. But I finished in November 17th of 2020, just in time for Thanksgiving, and thankfully also just before our hunting season, because I was probably more worried about that than anything. So what I'm going to do today is, it'll be about a half an hour of listening to me talk, and then I'll just open it up to questions and discussion. I am a geologist. I spent my career studying rocks, most of them in the Appalachian Basin, so I know them pretty well. But what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the Appalachians, why the rocks are where they are, why they look the way they do. And normally I have slides, but I don't have access to anything like this scale other than a couple of simple maps. And so you all have seen this, of course. This is just the Appalachian Trail from down here, Georgia, up to Maine. And so what I want to say just real generally is that the Appalachian Trail pretty much follows mostly metamorphic rocks throughout its entire extent. And there are also plenty of igneous rocks, and then often the trail will shoot off into the Great Valley or the Valley and Ridge province of the Appalachian Sedimentary Basin, and you'll be walking over top of sandstones and in some cases limestones and shales and so forth. But for the most part, the majority of the trail, starting in Georgia, follows what's known as the Blue Ridge. So down here, all the way up to South Mountain, Pennsylvania, which is where we are right now, in fact. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. But anyway, so so South Mountain is pretty much all the way up into Pennsylvania, and then the trail, of course, jumps across into the Great Valley and then across to the Valley and Ridge province, where it follows those nice, long, continuous ridges all the way into New Jersey and then up into New York a little ways. And then you get back into mostly metamorphic and some igneous rocks again. But just as a real brief introduction, and I've got some samples, you can pass them around if you like. There's examples of some metamorphic rocks, some igneous rocks, and some sedimentary rocks. But in general, most of you have probably had geo classes in high school or maybe even in college, but sedimentary rocks are those rocks that are just made up of fragments of other rocks, and they've been eroded by rain and ice and snow and so forth, and then carried by water and deposited in rivers or along shorelines in subsiding basins. Igneous rocks, they were melted at one time. Okay, all igneous rocks were at one time molten in what's known as magma. And then they were either solidified as things like granites or diorites in magma chambers. And you can kind of envision the, if you've ever had a glob light or a lava lamp at home, and you know the way the lava lamp sort of slowly forms those upside down teardrop shapes, and they slowly rise. It's not exactly like that, but that's a good visual to understand how magma chambers sort of burn their way up through the Earth's crust, because they're hot, they're very, they're much lighter than the surrounding rock because of their heat, and so they just slowly rise. And some of them end up making it to the surface or accessing the surface in the form of basalt flows or lava flows. And we see a lot of that on the Appalachian Trail, like for example in the Shenandoahs. There's, and in fact even around here, all the way up in the South Mountain, there's a period of time where Catoctin age rocks, which are Precambrian in age, around 700 million years old, I believe. And it was during a time when one of the early supercontinents that the Earth was, in transition during this time, and it was, the continents were moving apart like they are now, and then at a point, just under 1 billion years ago, they began to come together, and then when they pulled apart again to form what was known as the Iapetus Ocean, there were cracks that formed and allowed these deep magmas to come to the surface, and that's what the Catoctin represents. And then later that was buried deeply, and metamorphosed into a metamorphic rock known as greenstone. So we have some of that around here. We have a whole lot of it down in the Shenandoahs, and then later on there were sandstones that were deposited on top of that, a sequence including I believe it's the Cambrian Weaverton sandstone, and then that was metamorphosed. It was also buried very deeply and changed into what's known as a quartzite. And these quartzites are very common along the trail. They're really common along the Blue Ridge in particular. And then as you get up into Pennsylvania, most of the rocks that are following the ridgeline in Pennsylvania, they range in age from, there's some Pennsylvanian age rocks, which are about 300 million years old, and all the way up to Silurian, maybe 420 million years old. But the ridge forming units that make up those ridges that the Appalachian Trail follows along, most of those rocks are either what we call orthoquartzites. It's a kind of a sandstone that very clean, very tough, and when you're walking on it, you know it. People complain about it all the time. And then, as you move further to the east into New Jersey, that's known as the Tuscarora, around not far from here. And then eventually, as you move into New Jersey, that same rock, they changed the name to Shawangunk, and it's considered a metamorphic rock there, or a quartzite. So I know it's kind of hard without a lot of visuals to see this. So what I wanted to do, just for the next couple of minutes, is I've got a few excerpts that I want to read from my book that will lead into some more geological discussion. And in addition, some of these are just human interest stories that I think you might find interesting. But this was just a start for me, and this was back in June 5th of 2020. It was a Friday, and it was basically my day zero down at Amicalola Falls. So today was a perfect day to start my hike, here in the lush green hills of northern Georgia. It was clear and sunny with temperatures in the low 80s. Already late afternoon, the time was about 5 p.m. as I stood for a photograph under the stone arch just behind the Amicalola Falls Welcome Center. This iconic arch marks the beginning of the approach trail to the Appalachian Trail. As I passed my starting point, there was an initial steep ascent up to a reflection pool at the base of the falls. People were fishing, sitting on benches, or just strolling around this picturesque pond. Gazing the crowd, I could see that I was the only person wearing a backpack. Everyone here seemed so relaxed and carefree, but I had this intense feeling like I was on a mission. Continuing on from here, I began a steady climb up the 604 wooden steps to the top of the falls, all the while wearing my 50-pound LL Bean backpack. To say this was not easy would be a gross understatement. This initial stair climb would prove to be a sobering introduction of things to come over the next couple of months. So I was just getting started, and as I mentioned earlier, I had in mind maybe, a month of doing this, 500 miles, whatever that would take. And I was prepared for just that. And after making that first climb, I was really questioning my sanity. Like, is this really what I want to be doing? And I'm sure if, there's a lot of thru hikers out here, I'm sure. And I'm sure you all have gone through that same thought process. So, but the very next day I got to Springer Mountain, and when you get to Springer Mountain, the rocks there's a lot of what we call metasediments, and metasediments are just metamorphosed sandstones, shales, and limestones, and whatever the sedimentary rocks that were later deeply buried and then uplifted and eroded down to happen to be. And in that part of the Blue Ridge, there are a lot of quartzites. Again, it's a very common, quartzites are one of the most common metasediments along the Appalachian Trail, let's just say, because they hold up ridges probably better than any other rock. And in fact, when we talk about the Pennsylvania trails and how tough they are, it's primarily because of the Tuscarora, Shawangunk, orthoquartzite quartzites, that I mentioned earlier. And when you think about there's a thing geologists call the Mohs hardness scale, and it's just a ranking of softest to hardest minerals. And quartz, being a mineral, is number 7 on that list. So it's not the hardest, but it's it's number 7 out of 10. And you think, well, there's other things that are harder, like maybe granites or whatever's above that. Well, it turns out the only thing above quartz on the Mohs hardness scale are things like corundum, diamonds, and topaz. Well, there's no rocks that are made up in aggregate of those minerals. So of all the available minerals to make up rock units, quartz is as tough as it gets. And when you deeply bury that, for hundreds of millions of years and push out all the porosity and you just have pure quartzite, and then you break that up because it's very brittle. It's very, very hard, but it's very brittle. And so when the trail ends up being comprised of that, there's nothing out there. Certainly granites and gneisses are not anywhere near as tough on your feet as quartz, because quartz, being essentially the hardest mineral, that's comprising the entire rock, nothing can compete with that. But typical granite has, maybe 40–50% quartz. And then the other grains are much, much softer minerals. So they tend to weather out, and walking on those often, you feel like it's kind of a gritty surface. You've probably noticed that before. But it's much easier hiking trails in places where there's granites or gneisses as the type of bedrock. So then a couple days later, and I'm not going to read that much, really. I just have 2 semi-back-to-back stories that I want to share with you here. But a couple of days, let me find this here. Yeah, so a few days later, this is around Tesnatee Gap. It's day 4 into my thru hike. But some really interesting things happened I wanted to share with you. One was this interesting encounter between a hawk and a squirrel, and another was this young lady that I met that I was just blown away that somebody like this would be on the Appalachian Trail, an Olympic athlete. So after Tesnatee Gap, it was up and over yet another challenging ridge, and then back down to Hog Pen Gap. From here, the trail ascended up towards several more minor peaks, but was fairly gently sloping, much of it following an old logging road. Mountain laurels and rhododendrons occupied nearly the entire trail as a canopy for miles. At one point, I caught a flash of something passing by my left side, then followed by a crash of feathers and fur on a hefty tree next to me. Without hesitation, a large hawk swooped back onto a branch for a split second, only to make a second piercing dive toward a stunned squirrel, lifting the dazed rodent from the ground by his talons. With the steady pulse of his immense wings, the predator and his prey disappeared into the blur of the canopy overhead. Then, as I continued along the trail, I noticed up ahead a pigtailed young lady who was wearing what I would consider casual street clothes. As I approached, we both said hello, exchanged a few niceties, and then I continued onward. A little while later, I was rooting through my pack for an energy bar, and she caught up to me. We began talking and then started back on the trail together. She told me about her work in Chicago as a trainer for young girls in gymnastics and about her immigration to the U.S. from Belarus. I asked if she was ever in the Olympics, and her response was, yes, when I was 19, but we didn't do well that year because the Russian team was so strong. I was surprised and impressed. What are the odds of encountering an Olympic athlete on the AT? Apparently, she was on respite from her job in Chicago and wanted to see the South. I never learned her last name, but Natasha and I hiked for the next 2 hours together until she finally decided to turn back and return to her car at Hog Pen Gap. So I've had a lot of experiences similar to this, and I'm sure many of you have as well, where, you know, just out of the blue, you meet people that you would think, oh my gosh, why would they be on the Appalachian Trail? Yeah, I've met some long distance runners, like 100-milers, fastest known time record holders, folks like that. You know, as well as folks that maybe you don't even realize, you know, maybe in their past pre-retirement life, maybe they ran a major corporation or whatever. But, you know, I think hiking the Appalachian Trail is sort of the great equalizer, right? Because we're all the same when we're out on the trail. We're just out to make something great happen in our lives, you know, doing a long distance hike, or you know, trying to fulfill an accomplishment or a goal that you had, you know, earlier in your life. And just the solitude and the peace and the beauty that's out there it's hard to describe unless you go through it, and many of you know what I mean. So I think I'm just going to jump to my last one here. And by the way, my through hike consisted of starting in early June and then hiking north until I got to Pennsylvania at Swatara Gap. And then at that point, I took about a week off and I did what's known as a flip-flop. So rather than being a no-bow, I was now coming down from Maine back to Pennsylvania as a so-bow. And so that was an interesting transition. I remember when I left Pennsylvania, it felt like I was still in the summer. The nights were warm, you know, 60, 70 degrees. The days were in the 80s. It was just, you know, Pennsylvania summers, right? Like it is right here. And when I got to Maine, suddenly the nights were dipping into the 30s. And, you know, wisely I brought my my heavy sleeping bag because I hadn't been using one up to that point. And it was imperative that you had a warmer sleeping bag under those conditions. But anyway, so I think the hardest day that I had on the Appalachian Trail was one day in the White Mountains. And all of you who have hiked through the White Mountains probably have at least one story of, like how you survived, this mountain or that mountain. And for me, it was Mount Lafayette. And it was early October, and the weather was really crappy to begin with. And so I'll kind of go through this. This was day number 110, October 8th, 2020. It was a Thursday, Garfield Shelter to Franconia Notch. And at the time I was hiking with a young gentleman by the name of Fenway from Boston. So I get up at 5:30 in Garfield Shelter. It was a very cold night with heavy rain and high winds all night and into the morning. I made a hot breakfast undercover with my other comrades and was on the trail with Fenway by 7:30 a.m. Strong winds accompanied by a persistent cold rain followed us all morning on our way up to Lafayette. Despite the bitter cold morning, I was working up a sweat climbing the steep rocky trails, so I took off my puffy coat and rain jacket just wearing fleece and woolies. Even with both jackets off, I continued to perspire on our approach to the Alpine zone. We were both eager and excited to see what lay ahead. Just before the end of the tree line, I put back on my puffy coat, rain jacket, and Gore-Tex mittens to prepare for the next part of our journey. When I emerged from the thick Krumholtz zone, I immediately felt the harsh sting of the icy wind hit me from the side, and I caught my first glimpse of what was in store for us. Above the tops of the frosted dwarf spruce trees, all I could see through the blur of blowing snow was shimmering icy rock in every direction. Now you have to understand, when you break into the Alpine zone on Lafayette, you're at about 4,200 feet, and the top is 5,260, I believe. So we still had 1,000 vertical feet ahead of us. So we began our ascent onto the gigantic slabs of Mount Lafayette granite, with every surface covered in glades of slippery ice. Every move of the hand or foot was carefully calculated, making it a very slow process. I was being overcautious so as not to lose footing or slip or slide. It was hard to see the white blazes, now obscured by the raging ice storm, encoding on the rock faces. I was moving excruciatingly slowly, just crawling up the rocks. Excuse me. It was a toilsome exercise to stay balanced with the high wind and my top-heavy pack. Fenway was somewhere ahead, navigating the same set of seemingly impossible obstacles. The fierce winds would eventually tear his pack cover away, sending it sailing across the mountain, never to be seen again. In addition, the gale-force winds eventually would shred his frog-tog rain pants, so that all that remained was the linen layer beneath the now absent rubber coating. We were looking around, and there was nothing but ice-covered rock ahead of us, and the trail there is very steep. And we weren't sure if it was going to be marked sufficiently through the ice glaze covering, or if we're going to get somehow lost up there. And I think there wasn't really a time where I thought that my life was in danger or anything, but I do remember thinking that I can now understand how people do die up on the trail in situations like this, if you're not prepared enough, or if you're just at the wrong place at the wrong time. So suffice it to say, I eventually made it up and over Lafayette, Lincoln, Haystack, and then onto the Franconia Notch later that evening. I was supposed to meet my shuttle driver at a certain exit on the road, and they call it a highway, but it's really just a two-lane road through Franconia Notch. And as I was walking along the highway, this New Hampshire policeman pulled me over, and he said, "What do you think you're doing?" I said, "Well, I'm walking to meet my shuttle driver." And he said, "No, you're not allowed on the road. You have to go back to the trailhead, follow that all the way to the parking lot, which is about a mile away," and it was in the wrong direction, "and then have your shuttle driver pick you up there." So I thought, oh, great. So he said, "Where's your COVID mask?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if I have one anymore." And so he handed me one. He said, "Get in the back seat." So he opens the door and threw my pack in. I sit down, and he gets in front of me, and he says, he says, okay, well, I need your name, address, phone number. And he calls me in, checks me out, and I guess, you know, he was satisfied that I wasn't a serial killer or whatever. I said, I'm a retired geologist living in Pittsburgh, and I'm just out doing the Appalachian Trail. And he looked at me in the rearview mirror and he said, he goes, you know, I went to Pitt a few years ago, and in fact, I took a geology class. I thought, oh, fantastic. So we started talking about that, and he said, I'll tell you what, why don't I drive you to your pickup spot? And so he did, and dropped me off there, and I really appreciated his kindness, and he probably could have given me a citation for whatever it was that I was doing wrong, walking on the highway. So anyway, it all ended well. But one of the interesting things about Lafayette and that whole Franconia range, and I believe maybe including Garfield before that as well, it's all Jurassic granite, and Jurassic age is just about 200 million years old, and these are the youngest rocks on the Appalachian Trail, and they're all and there's a lot of granites that, as you're hiking along the metamorphic provinces, you often stumble across granites, and the reason for these granites is they're ancient magma chambers that fed volcanoes, or in some cases the magma never made it to the surface until it solidified, and then, you know, through uplift and erosion, is now at the surface today. But these are the youngest rocks on the Appalachian Trail, and they're just up in the White Mountains. And it's interesting too, if you look at a regional geologic, well, this isn't going to be that interesting to most of you, I'm sorry, but there's actually there's a line of seamounts out into the Atlantic Ocean. So as the Atlantic was opening, there was this zone of weakness that continued to allow for magma to reach the surface, and there's a whole series of seamounts that follow that line out into the Atlantic Ocean, right out to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, of course, is the opening, the main series of faults that began rifting at the end of the last supercontinent, which was Pangaea. And I didn't really get into a whole lot of this early on in my talk, but usually when I give a talk, I sort of start off talking about plate tectonics and how there were three major mountain building episodes that created the Appalachians, and those are the Taconian, the Acadian, and the Alleghenian. And the grain in the mountains, like, you know, when you look at the Valley and Ridge, for example, I mean, the grain through Pennsylvania is reflective of the very last orogeny, which was the Alleghenian orogeny, which took place, you know, roughly 300 million years ago. But there were two other ones that occurred before that, and the reason these occurred was we had continents that were attempting to come together, and they were what are called island arcs, like volcanic island chains, microcontinents, and then finally major continents that collided with North America for those three orogenies. So that was that's just sort of a thumbnail sketch of the tectonic events that formed the mountains, and then over hundreds of millions of years of erosion, they wore down to the roots that we see today. And so, you know, the mountains that we see today compared to what they were several hundred million years ago, no comparison. Think of the Himalayas, and that's what the Appalachian Mountains looked like about 300 million years ago or less. But they've just since been wearing down, you know, since that point in time. So what I found interesting about, you know, is when I was walking along the trail, you know, I would see rocks all the time, and I would pick them up and I would look at them and I'd try to identify them. But I never brought them with me. I didn't want to, I mean, the last thing you want to do is put rocks in your backpack, right? So, unless you're just out for the day or something. But when I came back, I gave a couple of talks to some geological organizations and some podcasts and so forth. And I always get asked the question, well, did you bring back any rocks? And I always have to say no, and kind of feel guilty about it. But it's all about weight, and the last thing I want to do is add more weight to my already too heavy backpack. So anyway, that's about all I had. I just wanted to give you folks a brief overview about the rocks that are under your feet on the Appalachian Trail, and a couple of stories to go with them. But if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yeah. Yes.
What type of rock is Katahdin?
Katahdin's granite. Yeah, there's a massive pluton right in the area of Mount Katahdin, and it continues south for a pretty good ways, but it's granite, yeah. Yeah. And granite's primarily quartz, potassium feldspar, muscovite, mica, and amphibole, which is a black mineral, but primarily silica is the main constituent in different forms. Mm-hmm. Yes?
The youngest are in New Hampshire. Where are the oldest?
Oh, the oldest. Well, so there was prior to the Taconian orogeny, like 450 million years ago, there was another orogeny about 1 billion to 1.2 billion, and those rocks are known as Grenville age rocks, and they represent, and I'm getting around to answering your question, but they represent some of the oldest rocks on the trail, and they are part of the Blue Ridge. So along the Blue Ridge, you can find some of the oldest rocks, and there are definitely some billion-year-old rocks in the Blue Ridge. Yes?
What type of rock is the skelton?
I was wondering that too. I think coming from, if it's Blue Mountain, it might be Tuscarora, or it could even be Mississippi and Pocono. I have to take a quick look at it, but but it's a tough sandstone, and whether it's Pocono or Silurian Tuscarora, which is much older and probably a little tougher, they're both pretty hard on the feet. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where that came from. It obviously wasn't very far from where he built it, because I don't think he transported those rocks that far. Yes.
Okay, so since you flip-flop, because usually they say the worst rocks in Pennsylvania start where you stopped, you're going north, and you went all through the White Mountains, which is nothing but rock. Tell me if you think Pennsylvania has earned its reputation as Rocksylvania.
Well, when I was, I'll answer it like this. When I was a kid, I used to think that, because I used to come back with blisters all over my feet after just a weekend hiking trip, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is like the worst place to hike. But honestly, when I came back down through Pennsylvania, it wasn't that bad. And I mean, I think in part because my feet were a lot tougher after 5 months than they were, when I was younger and I would be just doing these weekend jaunts. But as I said earlier, it's all quartzites and orthoquartzites, and they are by far the toughest rocks you're going to walk on. So I do think it's deserving, and I just didn't happen to notice it myself, but I think I was just more prepared when I finally came through toward the tail end of my hike. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out and staying around for my talk. Thank you. And by the way, I have, I wrote this book back in 2021. It's called Rocks, Roots, and Rattlesnakes. And it's the story of my adventures on the trail. You've heard a few excerpts. And I also have a website by the same name where you can go out and you can read excerpts from a whole bunch of different chapters. And then lastly, I'll say I brought some copies along if anybody would be interested in one. But thank you so much for coming out.
All right, so that was an interesting talk, and I don't know about you guys, but I always find the geology and the history of an area that I'm in is always interesting. I like history of anything.
Right, and Karen and I have really been taking notice to the trail itself and what is on the trail and what's behind the trail, and like he said, what you're walking on.
Right.
It's very interesting.
All right, so thanks, Craig, and we enjoyed it. And if you guys, once again, the book is called Rocks, Roots,
And rattlesnakes.
and Rattlesnakes. All right. W-O-Y, Wandering Out Yonder.
Oh, you're wandering out yonder. I saw you on Facebook.
Did you? That's
Oh, okay, gotcha. All right, yeah.
So this is the only place that you are going to find on the entire Appalachian Trail that they actually encourage you to feed the wildlife. This is the donation box outside of the AT Museum, and we encourage you to feed